What's up guys, Mel here back in the studio, and today I'm going to be showing you how I made Blame It on the Timing, which is actually my very first release as a solo artist, so I'm super excited to show you how I made it. If you haven't heard the track already, here's a little preview. Now, this track has already been out for quite some time now, probably like 9 months or so, but I'm finally getting around to showing you how I made it. Last week, I actually did a video comparing my original track of Blame It on the Timing to a remake that one of my subscribers made. So if you haven't checked that out already, go check it out from last week's video. I think it was a pretty interesting video, kind of comparing all the different aspects that really makes a track go from sort of mid-level production to that final extra stage where it's finally ready to release. So yeah, if you want to go check that out, I'll make sure to link it in the description so you can find that easily. Now, in just a second, we will dive into all the production and a bunch of interesting things on how I made this track. But first, I just want to give you a little bit of background on the track itself. I actually started making this track a little over a year, probably like a year and a half ago. And I actually started making this track while I was on the road. I was on a big road trip and doing some traveling and stuff. And so probably like 90% of this track was actually created just on my laptop, like going from Starbucks to Starbucks. I would like literally just stop on the road and go to a Starbucks. I think one time I spent probably like 8 hours on a Starbucks, and I was literally using these, like this little shitty pair of headphones and a mouse, and sitting at Starbucks like all day just working on my computer trying to create this idea and do the sound design and stuff. So it really wasn't until like maybe the last month or two that I finally got home and got some slightly better speakers to start kind of mixing on and stuff. But yeah, it was a really interesting track to make, and it was only in that last like final production that I actually got a proper studio. It wasn't even a proper studio. If I have a picture of the setup I had, I'll put it on screen. But anyway, that's sort of how the track got created. I was just driving on the road and had this idea for a track. And so yeah, with that said, I'll actually play you a version of the track in its like one of its first forms. I have that as like a reference track actually up here, and then you can hear the final track, and then we'll see how I made all the layers, all the production. I'll start with the drop and then maybe go somewhat into the break and stuff. So let's get into it. Okay, so just to show you how kind of shitty it actually started out as, this was, this might have been one of the first, I don't know if this was like one of the first exports. This might have been an export like once I had gotten the song like mostly completed, but this is kind of how it sounded before I started mixing and getting down into all the like fine details. You can obviously hear the idea is there, but it just doesn't sound good. Like the low end sounds wimpy and the leads sound bad. It just sounds like, I don't know, super sloppy. Versus compared to one of the very last exports, it sounds like this. Just much more tied together, much more powerful. So yeah, there is a big process of, it's like, I don't know if you guys have heard that sort of rule of like the 80-20 rule, where you can get 80% of the work done with 20% effort, and then the last 20% of the work takes 80% effort. And that's very true for music too. You can kind of get the big outline of a song roughly down with like 20% effort, just get all the elements in place. But it's really coming down to that mixing in the last 20%. Maybe you're at that 80 or 90% mark of where your track is getting there. It's getting good, but it's like, that's the time where it takes the most effort. So I probably spent, I don't know, maybe like 20, 30 hours at least mixing, fine tuning, all that stuff. Anyway, enough talking. This project is probably going to lag super hard because I'm recording right now. And by the way, forgot to mention this earlier. This is like literally 104 tracks. I'll zoom out and show you. You can see it's a pretty big project. So yeah, it's going to lag a bit. So I'm just going to start going through these elements and solo each one so I can actually play it back, hopefully without it freaking out. All right, so step number one with this track was, of course, the melody. I'm a big melody guy, and this was the melody I came up with. Like I said, I was on the road. I don't remember exactly where I came up with the melody, but it just kind of popped into my head. And so, of course, I started working on the leads. The leads individually sound like this. Okay, so I just have one pattern here. It looks pretty simple, but there's actually a bunch of things going on. First, let's go through and look at the individual elements, the individual layers. Play these. Yeah, so I have, I'm pretty big on layering, but in this track, I have a ton of layers. I have probably like, I don't know, 15 layers or so. It's a bit overkill. So I'm not actually going to go through each individual one, so you can kind of just see a couple one of these here. But what I'm going to do is I will just go into here. I've actually gone ahead and for each of these layers, I've split them up into individual tracks. And so this allows me to go through and process each one individually and really focus on each individual sound. In this case, on this track, I had originally kind of gone for like an init style lead, just like a very basic saw with a little bit of white noise. And this is kind of what it sounds like. There's a very certain characteristic that sound has that I can't quite explain, but obviously you can hear it. But as you can hear, hopefully, if you're wearing headphones, this sound is actually put out kind of to the side. And so what I ended up doing is this used to be a mono lead. Let's see, what's going to 3? Yeah, so this is a lead here. You can see it's 5 voices of saw, but it's on re-trigger, so they're all in the center, and then 1 voice of white noise and no effects here. So it's very basic sort of sound, but I ended up finding this sound, which I liked better. Just gave it a certain different characteristic. And that was this sound in Serum. And I found with a saw, sort of a saw kind of sound, and then a sine wave too. And so that ended up being the sound that I wanted to be in the center. So what I did is instead of having just like deleting this sound, I actually used it. But what I did to separate that out is I used a stereo enhancer and I did a phase offset. So pretty much this sound is kind of playing like out to the side, and it allows my main lead to actually be right in the center. But it still kind of lets this second sound give the characteristics, so it sort of enables both sounds to have the characteristics of both sounds. So here's just a main lead. Here's the second lead. And together they sound like this. And personally, I think that sounds, they just like mesh very well. Some sounds don't work together super well, and these sounds do. So those were really those were my main sounds. Once I got these two, I was really happy. You can see I have some different effects on here, a little bit of distortion, some EQ boosting the mids, more distortion. On this one, I have, some distortion, some OTT, and like the important one that I showed you is actually the one that brings it out to the side. Just for reference, I'm actually going to turn off this plugin, and you can hear how messed up it sounds when they're both in the center overlapping. It's just, they're fighting with each other, and it just doesn't work that well. Anyway, those were my two main sounds, and then pretty much once I was happy with those, then I just started layering a bunch of what I call supportive sounds, a bunch more like detuned stuff. So I have this one. It's called the DP lead, Dirty Palm lead. A more like detuned Plucky lead. Another one that sounds pretty similar. Tremor lead. Sort of detuned saws with like a bit of attack and longer release. Pretty low in the mix, that one. A lot of these leads, like some of these I just turned way down low in the mix, you can hear. Sort of an octave there. And then these leads all go to one bus. So you can see all of these are going to the bus I called leads. And this is really where a lot of the processing happened. So Yeah, I mean, you can see on each of these actually have a good amount of processing, but a lot of it is just EQing and kind of adjusting them so they fit with each other. Yeah, this one, I literally have like 4 different EQs. I don't know why. So those are all the leads. Let's say I have, I think like, yeah, 15 leads. That's a lot. And then they all go to this lead bus, like I just said. So on this lead bus, first I have a limiter, which I don't think that's actually doing a lot. I think I'm just using that to control the volume of the sound. Then that goes into a peak controller, which is controlling a reverb down the effects. I have an EQ to sort of shape the sound. I took out some sort of mid-highs that were a bit harsh. Second EQ to actually boost some of the more high-end, give it a little bit of crispy tone. I have a fruity compressor. This kind of makes the sound like longer. It sort of squishes the sound a little bit, so the sound like fills up more space. If I turn it off, it sounds like this. It's kind of subtle, but it made a difference when I was working with the sound. And I have a little bit of distortion with free fast distortion, just a little bit here. I ran it through Camel Crusher for more distortion as well as a little bit of compression. It makes a little bit of a difference. Stereo enhancer, I widened the sound up just a tiny bit. And then this is where I actually have 2 reverbs on this lead. I don't often do that, but I have this first reverb, which is controlled by the peak controller, I believe. And as you can see, I have a lot of low cut on there. So I'm sort of cutting that off at like, yeah, almost 900 Hertz, 885. So that kind of puts it in a space. And then I have the second reverb, which, as you can see, is very controlled. That is actually linked to this automation down here. So that I have a second reverb, which has a bit more low mid-end in it. And that is controlled. I just use an automation clip so I could be more precise with it rather than the peak controller. So that's kind of the effects on here. And then the lead bus actually goes to lead bus 2. You can see I have a bunch of effects on here as well, but I actually have them turned off. I just had gone way too overkill, so I just completely turned off all these effects. So essentially this goes to here, and then that has no effects, and then this goes to another bus called lead effects. And on here, I have a couple more effects, but nothing too crazy. Just taking some resonant frequencies out. I actually had a transient processor, but I turned it off. Now this, if you watched last week's video, this is an interesting plugin, and this has kind of, I would say, maybe a bit more advanced technique. What this allows you to do, it's actually Patcher, which is a FL Studio native plugin. But what this allows you to do is it separates the mid frequencies, the mono frequencies, from the stereo frequencies. And so if I open this up, it basically allows you to EQ them separately. So I can like take out specific frequencies from the side, and then I can take out or boost specific frequencies from the mid. So you can see I took out like a certain resonance here, boosted some low mids. So you can shape the sound in a pretty precise way that you couldn't with like a regular EQ. So let me turn that off and you can hear what it sounds like. So hopefully you can hear that actually really shapes the sound. It takes away some of the high end. Because of EQing it specifically on the stereo and mono frequencies, you can actually control kind of whether the sound is more stereo or mono based on how much you add or take away. So that's a really interesting plugin, kind of important plugin for how these leads actually sound in this track. I have a bit of delay. I think that's actually linked to an automation clip as well. Delay. I don't know, maybe not. Is that? Oh yeah, linked to something. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's just for, I have it like in the breakdown. It ends up turning on for sort of the melody as it builds down, but that's not in the break, or that's not in the drop. So there's that. Of course, I use Kickstart all the time for sidechaining. That's just at 100%. I have Fruity Balance. So this is an interesting one, and this is one I talk about all the time. I've created an automation clip for I use Fruity Balance for volume control. And you can see this is my volume control. I use it in very specific points just to kind of cut off the lead. So let me play this section right here without it. You can hear it sounds a bit sloppy, so let me turn it on and hear the difference. It's pretty subtle, but right here it's kind of chopping off that note. So instead of being ba, 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 it's ba, 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 ba. It's like making it a lot more distinct. So I use volume automation clips all the time to like really emphasize a rhythm, if that makes sense. The other thing that I use volume automations for is having sort of that like stutter effect that like Mesto uses a lot, different stuff like that. So you can actually, like right here, for instance, I have the volume that goes in this whole wavy pattern. And then I also have a cutoff. So it kind of reintroduces the melody. So let me play this so you can hear it. That like brrrr sound. If I didn't have the volume, it would sound like this. It's fine, but it's just not quite as interesting. So that's something you can do with volumes. Oftentimes what I'll do too is you can enable an LFO, and you can see if I adjust the speed of this, I can actually make automation clips for any of these parameters. So you can get pretty advanced with how you do that. In this case, I just needed a simple sort of waveform, a simple sine wave, so that worked just fine. And then the rest of the stuff I have in here is just a fruity low filter. I just use this to cut off the synth, and then another balance, which I'm not sure what I used that for. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about automation clips. We just talked about this volume, but as you can see, there's actually quite a few of these. So first we have volume. So this is cutting off the lead in certain parts. Then we have a stereo enhancer, which I'm not actually sure which one this is linked to. I think this is actually linked to an individual lead. Yeah, so what I ended up doing here is instead of like putting a stereo separator or a stereo enhancer on like all of the leads, I ended up putting a stereo enhancer on just my main lead. And so what I have is normally throughout the drop, it's just playing completely mono. If I go like this, you can see it's just mono, but then on this sort of like B part of the lead, it actually opens up and gets a little bit more stereo right here. It's very subtle, but I wanted the second part to kind of feel a bit wider. So that's what this automation clip is for. And then I have a couple more, I kind of forget what these are linked to, but I have a couple more automation clips that actually link to different parameters to sort of emphasize that, making this second part sound wider. The other thing that I actually ended up doing to make the second part sound wider is I actually ended up bouncing out some audio from one of the original leads that I had made and then ended up deleting later. But that sounds like this. I think it's actually in mono, but I ended up going in here and just doing like a little bit of stereo separation. So it just like sends it out to sort of the left ear. So that's kind of another layer in there. The other thing I did is I added this, which is a couple more leads. This is kind of like a harmony or like a counter melody. And it kind of comes in and adds a harmony right here. So yeah, those are a couple more layers that sort of help fill out that B part. Now coming down here, we have a few more automations. This is a pitch bend. So what I do when I'm making my leads is you can see there's a bunch of different little pretty subtle pitch bends, but they make a big difference. Let me show you what they would sound like without it. Here's with the pitch bending. And here's without. And here's it with again. Yeah, so stuff like that, pitch bending makes a huge difference. I'm sure you've heard it from a million people already, but yeah, making these pitch bends, I actually spent quite a lot of time tweaking them and changing them, but eventually this is the one I came up with, and you can see there's a lot of pitch bending in it. It really adds a bunch of character to the lead, so that's a super important one. We've already gone through this one. This is my second reverb, which just comes in a few spots and helps fill up the empty spaces. And then other than that, I think it's pretty simple. I just have this one that's this automation that's doing the cutoff, so it's taking away the high end of the synth. And then I have Another one that I use quite often is this. And what this is actually on the same love filter. Is it on here or is it on here? Yeah, so what I ended up doing is this is my main cutoff knob, but you can also change the resonance of your filter. And so that resonance is linked to here. So it just kind of gives it a different tone, like this. If I didn't have it, honestly, you probably can't hear the difference. It's really subtle, but it makes a little bit of a difference, and I just like the tone of it. And the only other thing I really did with my leads is I ended up sampling one note of it and then adding some reverb, and then I reversed it as this like little thing. So this sounds like, this is just a little, oh, it's not playing. Anyway, this sounds like this. If I turn it off, so that kind of like sucks you into the next part. And then I also have one here. Just kind of filling up those empty spaces again. And I think that's pretty much the leads. Okay, so moving on to chords. I actually spent quite a lot of time doing like sound design on these chords to get it to where I wanted it to be. Originally, I had a lot more like big saw sounds, and it just didn't sound quite right. And also I had these a lot louder in the mix, and it just, I don't know, it just sounded like not that great. So what I ended up doing is I opted to go with a lot of sort of like a lot more cutoff synths and a lot more piano sounds. And I ended up turning the volume of these way down. So it's, the whole track has more of a feeling of the leads and the bass, and it's not like these chords aren't so in your face. So let me go over some of these layers that I have. First I have these, which sound like this. They're saw chords, but you can see that I have this on a filter, so it's like a lot more cut off. Normally with like big saw chords, you just have like these big, like open, a lot of high end, but these I actually opted to use a lot more cut off synths. I have this in Serum. Super low in the mix, but it adds like kind of an octave, so that gives a little more high end. I have literally FL keys, just like a stock preset from that. A lot, like very low in the mix as well. And then I actually have, I'm not sure where I got this, but it's a house piano that's in Serum. It's a custom noise, so someone like imported a sound into Serum. Another sound, this actually sounds a lot like a piano, but it's actually a synth. It's kind of this like analog saw with a cutoff on it, and then just a little bit of effects. Sounds pretty similar to a piano. And then finally this, which is, again, it's kind of like a super saw, but very cut off, you can see. So all these sounds work really well together, and they just give like this kind of big epic piano sound. Now, one very important part about these chords, and I talked about this quite a bit in last week's video, is how I built the MIDI. So as you can see, hopefully, there's all these little notes that go up and down. So instead of just having static chords that are just on the same note the whole time, you can get away with that. But one thing I've always liked to do, even since I started my music production, is like kind of create melodies within the chords. So you almost have like these weird little melodies going up and down and counter melodies and stuff. So take a listen to this. Like even this, just adding this one note here. Like that and this. So just like on little tiny things, this one up here, it just jumps up. And you can, you know, sometimes if you want to follow the melody, you can have notes that follow the melody. Sometimes you can have notes that do something opposite of the melody. It makes the chords a lot more interesting. And also, like here, I have, you know, this note that's in between the two notes. So it adds like a little bit of dissonance. And it's not just like a regular triad chord. So I played around a lot with these kind of counter melodies and stuff, and this is what I came up with. But I just think it's, especially with these piano sounds, it just gives it like a very kind of like natural, organic feeling, something that just sounds a lot more interesting than basic like saw chords, triads. So I was really happy with how those chords came out. For processing, I actually ended up splitting these into their own separate tracks as well. A lot of times I'll just all route them to the same bus, but I processed them individually. This one you can see I took away a lot of the high end. I didn't want a lot of high end in these chords because the lead was taking up a lot of that high end, and it just, I don't know, it didn't sound quite as good. Like it sounded a bit like digital with too much high end in it. Here I took out some kind of weird resonant frequencies. Of course, sidechained it also at 100%. I added a little bit of reverb, which I think that's on either an automation clip or somehow a peak controller. And then I just have a filter to filter the chords out at a certain point. Okay, so basses is a very important part of this track. As you can see, I have all these layers of basses, and I also went over this a little bit in my last video, but pretty much, well, I just spent a lot of time creating these basses, and this is one of the parts of the track that really helped it go from sounding kind of just unfinished to really polished. This just added a lot of energy. First, I have my sort of main basses, my main bass line. A lot of these, I think, yeah, I have like just a ton of serum layers, probably like 10 or 12 or 13 different layers. I have one layer in Silent, and then I just have a ton of these basses in Serum. Here's a wider one. But just like a lot of like FM sort of synthy basses with like a lot of growliness, and together they all sound like this. Unlike the leads and chords, I actually didn't separate these out. A lot of times I probably should separate them out if I want to be like super pro, but honestly a lot of times I'll just send all my basses to one bus. So that's what I did for this track. I sent them here, did some EQ, some distortion with Camel Crusher, some sausage fattener, some more EQ taking away some of the high end, a bit more distortion. I did use the same trick with Patcher, but I ended up turning it off here. I actually made them a little bit more mono, the bass a little bit more mono with stereo enhancer, and that was kind of it. So that's sort of my main layer, and then I ended up just started adding a ton of layers. So I have a couple layers here that are just emphasizing certain notes. This is the first one, which is this really cool, like aggressive growl. It's just one layer in Serum. I think it's, yeah, from the Brooks Fusion sound bank. But it's a super cool growl. Just like this really growly, gnarly sort of sounding thing. And then I ended up adding this second layer, which is playing almost the same thing, but it just adds a couple different notes. That sounds like this. And this is actually some sounds that I used from my sound bank. This is one of them. So that's a growl that's like right in the center. And then I have a wider one. And together those really like fill up the frequency spectrum really well. So all three of those sound like this. That's kind of all my synths. And then after that, I started just adding synth shots, like bass shots, one shots. I added some from some sound banks that I have. And a couple more here. Just some like big hits. And then one thing that I've started doing and is super helpful, I really recommend you guys doing it, is I actually have started exporting like synth shots and bass shots from my previous tracks. So what I'll do is once I have like a whole bunch of basses layered together, is I'll just export like one note from that. And then that's already like a really good sounding bass. And so then you can just take those one shots and like layer it into new tracks as basses. And it just, they sound good. So take a listen to this one. That's a great sounding bass shot. Just like adds a ton of harmonic frequencies, and I would say makes your track sound very original, because you're taking like 10 or 15 different layers of bass from another track. And you know, when you have that many layers, they're always going to be a little bit different and a bit unique. So once you export that and you have your own sort of like audio library of your own sounds that you've made, I think it's a really good way to start building up your sound bank. Anyway, yeah, I added a bunch of those layers, and then one of the last layers, but very important layer, is this horn. It's kind of low in the mix. Like once it's playing with all the basses, you can't hear it, but it just adds a lot of energy. It sounds like this. It just sort of adds like an extra layer that sounds a lot more natural. Obviously, a horn is like an organic sound. And then last but not least is the sub bass. This is pretty simple sub bass. I just have 2 layers of sine waves, 1 octave apart, running through a lot of distortion. If I turn off this, so I just have like a ton of distortion going on, cutting off the high end, cutting off the low end, going through fast distortion, camel crusher, and sausage fattener. So quite a lot of distortion on that. So with all of those like 5 million layers, this is what the bass sounds like. At that point, I was super happy with how the bass sounded. As Brooks likes to say, it's sort of like talks. The bass just has so much movement to it, and so that really helped push along the track. If I just play that along with the leads, you can already hear it has a ton of energy. So at this point, it's just coming down to the little details, of course, adding all the drums and effects, and just a little ear candy and stuff. Like right here, you can see I have this sort of hey one shot. And then I have drums, which honestly aren't very interesting. I have this kick, which is a kick from one of Amin Shen's Soundbank, Fusion 3, I believe. And then I actually ended up layering it with a top kick, which just adds a little bit more sort of punch to it, a little more click on the high end. And then I added this tom in too. Of course, some claps, including some drop claps. And then just a bunch of effects, downlifters, uplifters, stuff like that. And yeah, that's kind of the drop. Okay, so I think that was probably the most interesting part of the track, is looking at the drop. But just really quickly here, I want to go through the break as well. I usually start my tracks with the drop. So I create a melody that brings the energy of the track, and then I have to go back and start going through the break and figure out what I want the break to be, if I want a vocal in there. In this case, I was actually able to find a vocal that I really liked on Splice. So let me just solo that really quick. This is the vocal just by itself.
Don't need you, I just got caught up, baby. We can blame it on the timing, but you know.
For the longest time when I was designing this track and creating it, I actually just had this one vocal that repeated over and over and over. And it didn't sound bad, like it was fine, but it was pretty repetitive. So what I ended up doing is, and I didn't find this till later, till I was almost like done with the track. I thought I was finished, and then I found this second vocal, which was from the same pack, but different key, and I had to repitch it and stuff. And I ended up, this is like one of my favorite parts of the track now, is this second vocal.
I needed to, got all these expectations, all I need to true. I want you, but I'm tired of the back and forth.
I just think it's a really cool vocal, like the whole melody of it, and with the production underneath, it just like, I don't know, I love the vocal. So I was really happy with that. Going back to the beginning, I kind of just wanted to create a lot of space for the vocal. I didn't want to have anything complicated. So I just sort of have this main pad here. This is a pad I just created like super quickly in Silent One. This is one of the things that I made while I was on the road. But what it is it's just kind of a, what do I have? One voice, 2 voices of saw. So like very simple. And then I ended up routing it into a cutoff filter. And the key here is that, as you can see, I have quite a bit of attack on the filter. So it gives it that sort of like wah-wah sound. Like if I turn this down, it sounds kind of boring, but as soon as I turn this back up, that's a bit too much, but it's just this very interesting, kind of gives it a lot of movement. So I have that one synth, and then under that I actually have FL Keys, which is a stock plugin, but I created this Rhodes preset. And together it just helps fill out the frequencies and sounds really good in my opinion. underneath that, I just have a lot of percussions, like a lot of just very subtle drums, some claps and some downlifters. So together it sounds like this. And then for a long time, it was just these instruments and some claps. And then at some point I was going through Splice and ended up finding this really cool sound. It was from a Cashmere pack, and it's this flute, which I think I just added a ton of reverb to it. So you can see here, I have actually reverb is cranked up all the way. I think I might have an automation clip for that. The decay is like 5.5 seconds. So it just gives it like this huge atmosphere sound, and it sounds like this. So I have that first one, and then I have a second one, which is pitched down. And so this just repeats. It just kind of like adds this big atmosphere, and that really helped form the signature sound of this track, is this like big atmospheric flute. So that was the intro, and then here, what I did, just to start building the energy, I brought in the second synthesizer, which is playing like 16th notes. Pretty cool synth, very simple. It's just another saw synth. I think I basically took the same preset that I used for the intro. You can see the same amount of saws here. And then I just ended up changing some of the parameters on one of these filters. So I made it a lot more like plucky, and then I just had like a ton of reverb on it. So it just like sounds very big. Another key unique thing, and I talked about this earlier, check out how much like counter melody and how much like these notes change. You can see I have these notes going up and down all the time, and like these little things, these little melodies. So it really just gives it like a whole, it almost tells a story. Like it, I don't know. Let me just play this for you and you'll hear it. Like up here, it goes up and then down, and it just keeps switching up. So that really, like, it's kind of in the background, but it just gives it a ton of energy. Plus it's the 16th note, so it's like you can feel the energy is building. And along with that, I also brought a bass in to have some low end. This is actually a preset that I really like. I think I created it in Silence. Nope, it's Serum. I forget where I found this preset, but it's like a really, I think I changed it to make it a little bit more plucky, but it's like, it's just this like warm bass, this warm plucky feeling that really worked well, in my opinion, with these notes. Like I don't know, it just gives it such a warm sound. Altogether, it sounds like this. The other thing that I didn't add for the longest time, and then I literally added it like right before the song released, is this thing. So what I did here is, this is a little pattern that I created actually when I did the extended version of the mix. Is I had these synths, it was like the main synth lead, but I cut it off a lot more so it didn't have the high end, and then I ended up putting like a ton of reverb and delay on it. And so I played that, and I was like, oh, that sounds really cool. So I ended up exporting the sound and just repitching it. So I just added it in as these like little audio files, and check this out. It has like this very cool sound to it. So let me play it without one more time. It already has a lot of those, like a lot of that energy with those 16th notes, and then it adds even more with this. You can't hear it's like super crazy with the vocal added on top, but it's there, and it just like starts building the energy. It's the sound of the lead, and it just, I don't know, I think it sounds really cool. This is another element that I added like right before I released the track. For the longest time, I forget exactly how it sounded before, but this is something I just one day kind of clicked into my head. I was like, oh, what if we do like this really crazy LFO synth thing? So I created this preset. You can actually hear, this is the original synth that I made, and I ended up exporting the audio, so I turned it off. But this is the synth. Apparently it's not going to play. but it's just a pretty simple saw synth. But what I ended up doing is I created this LFO. So for the cutoff on the synth, I created an automation for it. Then I turned on the LFO, and then I created an automation for the speed of the LFO. And so what that did is created this like wobbly sound, and that sounds like this. So I ended up doing that. I exported it out just so it was easier to work with. And then I ended up later, with it exported, I ended up stretching it out even more and like adjusting the timing of it. But that added like a very kind of, I feel like it's a pretty unique sounding kind of transition. So that sounds like this. And then of course it goes into the buildup. Of course, this build-up is like one of the most CPU heavy parts of the track, so I can't play it all at once. But what I did here is I started introducing the melody. Of course, I used some cutoff synths, so it sort of like builds in the background. You can also see I have a lot of reverb on the melody, so it's like, again, more in the background, but it sounds like this. And then I started layering up everything. I added a lot of the synths from the break, and then I started combining them with the drop synths. I added some ambience here, just some little like a little vocal sample or something. And then I forget if this is a sub. Oh, that's actually the drop bass. I put that on a filter, so it filters in, it's not too much energy yet. Of course, sub bass. And then I just added a bunch of impacts, a bunch of snares and claps and stuff down here. And then a bunch of risers and whatnot as well. I'm actually going to, let me try to mute these synthesizers so it's not freaking out, but I'm just going to play all the drums individually so you can hear how crazy it is. So those are the drums of the buildup, and then back to the drop. The other thing that I did in the build-up to really help sort of build up the energy is I did some interesting things with the vocals. So I have this first layer down here that sounds like this. It goes up here, and then I have a couple different like reverses and parts of the vocal. The vocal comes in right before the drop too. We can blame it on the timing, but you know. And then up here, I added another layer of vocals, which is another repeating phrase that sounds like this. With all that, it really just kind of, everything adds up. Bringing in the synths, bringing in all the risers, and then of course having the vocals also build up. And that is really what like brings the energy up, getting ready for the drop. So there we have it. As you can see, I kind of have two projects in one, which is kind of weird. What I ended up doing is I have this first one here is the extended mix, and then this one here is just the regular version, the like radio edit. So I just kept them both in the same project in case I wanted to like manipulate any of the sections. But that's pretty much it. Hopefully there were a couple things that you picked up in that track that maybe you didn't know before. Nothing too crazy, but I'm still proud of this track. I think it's a really cool track, and I really like the vocal. Like I said before, I think it's a very cool vocal. Sometimes it's very hard to find good vocals, especially on Splice, so that just ended up working out super well. I will not be uploading an FLP for this as this is an original track, but hopefully at least you're able to kind of like see some inside information on how I did this track. So thanks so much for sticking around, guys. I know it was a much longer video than I normally do, just because there's so much to cover on this track. But I had a lot of fun showing you guys this, and if I missed anything, let me know down in the comments, because there was a lot to cover. So yeah, let me know if I missed anything, if you have any specific questions that I didn't answer in this track. Anyway, as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned, I have a bunch more videos coming out soon, lots of remakes, and also a lot of original music. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to release any original music by the end of this year. Hopefully, I'm hoping to get at least one track out, but if not, I'll have a bunch of new original music coming in 2023. So stay tuned for all of that. Again, guys, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to go check me out on Instagram. If you have any questions, you can always message me on Instagram or send an email. You can find my email in the About section on my YouTube channel. And that's it, guys. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We'll catch you back in the next one.